Part 1. This is the first part of today's report, and what is unfolding right now on the international stage looks less like routine diplomacy and more like a storm that is only beginning to take shape. Each fragment of information, each reaction from Washington, Moscow, and European capitals adds up to a pattern that may define the future of Europe, the stability of global politics, and even the fate of Ukraine itself. But before diving into the details, let's take a moment to understand how unusual, how fragile, and how deeply interconnected the current picture has become. Stay tuned till the very end of this story. You'll want to hear what comes next. And if you haven't yet subscribed, do it now, so you don't miss the second and third parts of this developing report. For months, intelligence agencies across the Atlantic have been quietly sharing assessments that are only now becoming public. The latest reports from U.S. intelligence, cited by Reuters, suggest that Vladimir Putin not only refuses to abandon his long-term ambition of capturing all of Ukraine, but is also considering new plans that extend far beyond its borders. The information paints a picture of a Russian leadership that still dreams of pushing its influence deep into the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, a chilling echo of past empires. Inside Washington, the tone is cautious, yet uneasy. Officials understand the implications, though public statements remain deliberately restrained. There's hope, or perhaps denial, that diplomacy might still work. But behind closed doors, the mood is changing. What makes the situation more alarming is how little attention this intelligence seems to be getting in the White House at the moment. The focus there is split between two other major stories that are shaking the American establishment. The first is the reopening of one of the most scandalous cases in recent U.S. history, the Epstein files. Despite heavy redactions, the documents have revealed names, connections, and photographs that could affect key figures in Washington. Among them, Donald Trump. The Department of Justice reportedly removed some of the images after publication, but they had already circulated online. The second distraction for Trump and his circle is Venezuela, where U.S. forces have intercepted another oil tanker suspected of violating sanctions. This cautious yet steady escalation near Venezuelan shores adds a layer of tension to an already overloaded foreign policy agenda. While these headlines dominate American news, the war in Ukraine continues with an intensity that few outside the region fully grasp anymore. Strikes, sabotage, and drone attacks have become daily occurrences, so frequent they barely make the news. Ukrainian forces recently struck two Russian Su-27 fighter jets at the occupied Belbek airfield in Crimea, causing millions of dollars in losses. Such operations no longer shock anyone. They have become part of the grim routine. Yet they reveal something deeper. The war is entering a stage where both sides adapt faster, and where the line between military and psychological warfare is blurring. But the real question is not only what Putin wants, it's whether he can still achieve it. After nearly 4 years of war, Russia controls less territory than it did in 2022. It's losing not just manpower and hardware, but also confidence. The economic toll has become undeniable. Sanctions bite, logistics falter, and strikes within Russian territory itself are no longer rare. Oil refineries, power stations, and storage depots burn under drone attacks. Russia feels the war inside its own borders now, and that changes everything. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, the Kremlin shows no sign of restraint. Putin appears convinced that time works in his favor, that Western unity will weaken, and that new leadership in Washington might hand him the victory he failed to secure on the battlefield. And this is precisely where the figure of Donald Trump re-enters the scene, not as a mere politician, but as a variable that could alter the entire equation. Sources close to U.S. intelligence and European diplomats confirm that Trump's team, led by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and his advisor Jared Kushner, is preparing to hold separate talks with both Ukrainian and Russian delegations. Officially, these are discussions about ending the war. Unofficially, they may serve a different purpose: to test how far Putin is willing to go and what he's truly after. But is the US really in control of these talks? Or is it being drawn into a game orchestrated from the Kremlin? We'll get to that soon. For now, understand this. There are two different realities running in parallel. One, the official narrative of peace negotiations and diplomacy. The other, the silent acknowledgement within intelligence circles that Putin's ambitions have never changed. The same man who ordered tanks into Ukraine in 2022 still believes he can restore what he calls historic Russian lands. And if this is true, then Europe's next crisis is already set in motion. Stay with us. In the next part, we will uncover what exactly U.S. intelligence knows about these plans, what role Steve Witkoff plays behind the scenes, and why American diplomacy may already be compromised. Before we continue, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, because what's coming next could reshape everything we thought we knew about this war, and about the fragile peace that still holds Europe together. Part 2. The second part of this report dives into the details that many have suspected, but few dared to speak about publicly. Over the past several months, documents and testimonies have begun to form a single, coherent narrative: that Vladimir Putin never viewed the war in Ukraine as a limited operation. From the very beginning, according to assessments shared between American, British, and Baltic intelligence services, his goal was total control of Ukraine, followed by a push toward the Baltic region. These conclusions, cited by Reuters and confirmed by several European officials, describe a Russian president who still believes he can redraw the borders of Europe. The most recent classified briefings to the U.S. Congress indicate that Putin's military and intelligence circles have been quietly rebuilding logistical routes along Russia's northwestern flank, areas that directly border NATO countries. American intelligence analysts now say that while Moscow's capabilities are stretched, the intention remains unchanged. Inside Washington, the tone has shifted. The White House insists progress continues in diplomatic talks, but insiders admit that the intelligence contradicts those claims. Sources familiar with the situation told Reuters that while the Trump administration's envoys report constructive dialogue, the National Security Council and CIA analysts see signs of deliberate manipulation by the Kremlin. The reports describe how Putin and his negotiators carefully feed fragments of optimism to American intermediaries, specifically to those who lack formal diplomatic training but possess political loyalty. Among these intermediaries, one name appears more and more often: Steve Witkoff. A billionaire real estate developer and close ally of Donald Trump, Witkoff unexpectedly became a key figure in the back-channel talks with Moscow. His position as Trump's special representative was not a product of traditional diplomacy, but of personal trust. And that, according to intelligence officials, is exactly what made him vulnerable. The Wall Street Journal recently published a detailed investigation describing how Witkoff's role began. In early 2024, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, passed a personal message from the Kremlin to Witkoff, suggesting that Vladimir Putin was ready to meet him in Moscow. The message, relayed through the Russian Direct Investment Fund and its head Kirill Dmitriev, contained a clear condition: Witkoff must come alone, without any diplomats, intelligence agents, or translators. When he arrived, Putin delivered a long, almost theatrical lecture about Russia's thousand-year history and its mission to protect the Slavic world. The meeting was less about negotiation and more about psychological evaluation. Russian security services reportedly prepared a detailed psychological profile of Witkoff beforehand, assessing how susceptible he might be to flattery, moral appeals, or the promise of historical significance. Those assessments, now part of internal U.S. intelligence memos, suggest that the Kremlin viewed him not as an opponent, but as an opportunity. After that initial visit, the nature of the talks changed dramatically. Witkoff became the unofficial bridge between the Trump administration and the Kremlin. Instead of seasoned diplomats, these meetings involved businessmen, advisors, and personal envoys who operated outside formal structures. The State Department was kept at arm's length, The post of U.S. ambassador to Russia remained vacant for months. Key experts on Eastern Europe were sidelined. In the meantime, Russian negotiators, many of them veterans of the security apparatus, began framing discussions not around Ukraine's sovereignty, but around security guarantees and regional stability. Behind this language, officials now believe, lay Putin's long-term strategy to legitimize Russian control over occupied territories while simultaneously testing America's willingness to protect its European allies. The deeper the talks went, the clearer the pattern became. Putin wanted to use the new political situation in Washington to extract concessions. His goal was not to end the war, but to prolong it on favorable terms. Intelligence sources familiar with the content of the negotiations claim that Russian diplomats repeatedly proposed temporary ceasefires tied to conditions such as freezing military aid to Ukraine or lifting specific sanctions on Russian energy companies. Each time, the arguments were wrapped in the language of pragmatism, economic recovery, global energy stability, and anti-inflationary measures. It was diplomacy designed to appeal not to moral principles, but to political calculation. And that, according to European officials, is where the danger lies. While the Trump administration publicly insists it is working toward peace, multiple European capitals fear that the Kremlin is exploiting this moment to reconfigure the balance of power. London, Warsaw, and Vilnius have all raised alarms that Putin might use the diplomatic process to prepare simultaneous pressure points, both in Ukraine and along the borders of NATO's eastern flank. British and Polish intelligence now believe that the Russian military, though weakened, could still carry out localized offensives in the Baltic region while maintaining the illusion of negotiation. Their reports describe troop movements in the Western Military District, the redeployment of short-range missile systems, and intensified activity of Russian naval forces in the Baltic Sea. All of this, they warn, could become the foundation for a new phase of hybrid warfare. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Trump's public statements appear to contradict his administration's private assessments. In interviews, he claims that Putin wants peace, that Russia is tired of fighting, and that a deal is within reach. Yet internal memos from the Defense Department and intelligence briefings to Congress reveal a far darker reality. U.S. analysts continue to assess that Russia maintains both the capacity and intent to escalate, not only in Ukraine, but across multiple regions. One official described the situation bluntly. The Kremlin's appetite didn't shrink, it just learned to hide its hunger. This duplicity extends beyond geopolitics. At the very moment when the U.S. government is attempting to manage delicate talks with Moscow, another scandal, one involving the release of the Epstein files, has consumed public attention. The newly published documents, though heavily redacted, mention numerous public figures, including former President Donald Trump. The files describe an encounter in 1994 when financier Jeffrey Epstein allegedly introduced a 14-year-old girl, identified in the documents as Jane Doe, to Trump at his Mar-a-Lago estate. The passage describing the moment, found on page 22 of the Department of Justice's release, states that Epstein playfully nudged Mr. Trump and made a comment about the girl's appearance. The girl, the document says, felt uncomfortable, but too young to understand why. The Justice Department has since removed several photographs and records from its website, though they remain accessible through archived links. The deletions have only fueled suspicion that politically sensitive material was being suppressed. For Trump, this comes at the worst possible moment. His administration is already under pressure from the Venezuela standoff, where the U.S. Coast Guard recently detained another tanker suspected of carrying sanctioned oil. The vessel, the Centurios, operated under the Panamanian flag and was reportedly transporting nearly 2 million barrels of crude for a Chinese company. Venezuelan authorities accused the United States of piracy and kidnapping, claiming the crew was taken into custody without due process. In response, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security issued a statement asserting that the operation was conducted to disrupt the financing of narco-terrorism in the region. It was the latest in a series of seizures that have pushed relations between Washington and Caracas to their lowest point in years. This dual crisis, legal and geopolitical, has consumed much of the administration's focus, leaving little bandwidth for Europe. And yet, Europe is precisely where the stakes are highest. In late December, intelligence agencies began circulating fresh reports suggesting that the Kremlin views 2025 as a strategic window of opportunity. With U.S. attention divided and European unity weakening under economic strain, Putin may attempt a synchronized escalation. Limited offensives in Ukraine combined with destabilization campaigns in the Baltics and the Balkans. The idea is not to provoke an immediate NATO response, but to create a sense of inevitability, to convince the world that Russia's expansion is irreversible. At the same time, the battlefield in Ukraine remains brutally active. Recent satellite imagery confirms explosions at an ammunition depot in the Bryansk region of Russia, while Ukrainian drones continue to strike targets in Crimea and along the front lines near Liman and Siversk. The pattern of attacks suggests increasing sophistication in Ukrainian drone warfare. The Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, claimed responsibility for destroying 2 Su-27 jets at Belbek airfield, along with an air traffic control tower, a precision strike that caused a chain reaction of secondary detonations. Analysts estimate the total damage at over $70 million. Yet, despite such tactical successes, the strategic picture remains uncertain. Russian forces have intensified assaults around Liman and Siversk, attempting to encircle Ukrainian units and open a path towards Sloviansk. According to Ukrainian military analysts, the offensive may mark the beginning of a new phase, one that seeks to exhaust Ukrainian defenses through constant pressure rather than large-scale breakthroughs. The situation on the ground mirrors the tension in the diplomatic arena, relentless, grinding, and far from resolution. Every move in Washington, every speech in Moscow, every small territorial change on the battlefield contributes to an unfolding geopolitical chess game that could reshape the entire region. The question now is not just whether Ukraine can hold, but whether the West can maintain its will to resist. Because in the corridors of power, from Brussels to Washington, fatigue is beginning to show. And Putin knows it. In the final part of this report, we will explore what these developments mean for the coming months, how the shifting U.S. political landscape could alter the balance of the war, what new strategies may emerge from both Kiev and Moscow, and why the next steps taken in Washington may determine not only Ukraine's survival, but the future of Europe itself. Stay with us. The conclusion will connect all these threads and reveal how the story you've just heard may shape what happens next. Part 3. As we move into the final part of this report, the picture that emerges is one of a world standing on the edge of a new confrontation. A confrontation that may not begin with a declaration of war, but with quiet, calculated steps that redefine the balance of power. The last weeks of December have revealed how the battle for influence has shifted from the trenches of eastern Ukraine to the corridors of Washington, Brussels, and Moscow. The struggle is no longer only about territory. It's about time. Who can outlast whom? Who will lose patience first? And who will shape the world that comes after? This is not a frozen conflict. It is a slow-moving political earthquake, one that is now rumbling beneath the foundations of global stability. Let's start with what is happening inside Ukraine. Despite the endless bombardments, the Ukrainian army continues to hold its defensive lines under extraordinary strain. Reports from the Institute for the Study of War and independent military analysts show that the Russian military, though heavily degraded, has not abandoned attempts to encircle key cities such as Liman and Siversk. The recent analysis by Ukrainian officer and strategist Konstantin Mashavets reveals that Russia has concentrated elements of its 20th and 25th Combined Arms Armies in the Liman sector, while the Third Army advances south of Siversk toward the Sloviansk-Bakhmut axis. These operations are part of a broader Russian goal: to seize the northern approaches to Sloviansk and force Ukraine to divert reserves from the southern front. According to satellite imagery, Russian units have managed to gain footholds near Yampil and Dubrova, while Ukrainian forces continue counterattacks from the west, attempting to prevent a deeper breakthrough. The situation remains fluid, but the toll is enormous on both sides. Inside the occupied territories, the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Residents describe an atmosphere of fear and repression. Russian security forces continue to detain civilians accused of collaboration with Kyiv, and reports from human rights organizations confirm that thousands have been relocated to filtration camps in Crimea and the Rostov region. Ukrainian officials say these actions are part of a broader effort to depopulate contested areas and replace the local population with those loyal to Moscow. Meanwhile, strikes on Russian logistics hubs and ammunition depots inside Bryansk and Kursk regions have intensified. The explosion in Novozubkov, which triggered a massive secondary detonation, was one of several attacks that week targeting Russian supply routes. These strikes, conducted by Ukrainian drones, are intended not only to disrupt the enemy's infrastructure, but also to send a clear message: the war is coming home to Russia. But while Ukraine continues to fight on the battlefield, a parallel war unfolds in the realm of politics and information. The revelations surrounding Steve Witkoff's role in back-channel negotiations with the Kremlin have raised serious questions about the integrity of U.S. diplomacy. The Wall Street Journal and Reuters confirmed that Putin personally selected Witkoff as a counterpart, bypassing official diplomatic channels. During multiple meetings in Moscow, Putin used the sessions not merely to discuss peace, but to test how far the Trump administration could be manipulated. Intelligence memos show that the Russian side provided Witkoff with exclusive intelligence insights, portraying them as gestures of trust, while in reality feeding distorted information designed to influence U.S. decision-making. Officials now believe that these operations were coordinated by the FSB's Directorate for Foreign Political Influence, the same branch responsible for interference in previous U.S. elections. What makes this even more alarming is that Trump himself seems to embrace Putin's framing of the conflict. In recent speeches, he has repeatedly stated that Russia is not the threat it is made out to be, and that Europe should pay for its own defense. Such statements, while politically popular among segments of the American electorate, are being interpreted in Moscow as signs of strategic fatigue. European leaders, especially in Poland and the Baltic states, are growing increasingly anxious. In Warsaw, Prime Minister Donald Tusk warned that the next 6 months will be decisive and urged NATO to strengthen its eastern defenses. In Tallinn, Lithuanian and Estonian intelligence agencies have issued joint assessments suggesting that Russia could attempt hybrid operations, including cyber attacks and sabotage, aimed at testing NATO's Article 5 commitment without triggering a full-scale war. The shadow of uncertainty now stretches across Europe. Meanwhile, Donald Trump faces a growing domestic storm. The partial publication of the Epstein files has reopened one of the darkest chapters in American politics. Thousands of pages, including photographs, testimonies, and flight records, were released under the Epstein Transparency Act. Though heavily redacted, the documents confirm the involvement of prominent figures from both major parties. Among them are former President Bill Clinton, Microsoft founder Bill Gates, and several Hollywood celebrities. But the most politically explosive detail concerns the mention of Trump himself. The document references an encounter at Mar-a-Lago in 1994 between Epstein, Trump, and a 14-year-old girl later identified as Jane Doe. Although no charges have been brought, the description of events and the subsequent removal of related photographs from the Department of Justice website have fueled widespread outrage. The Justice Department insists the deletions were made to protect the privacy of victims, yet critics argue they suggest political interference. The controversy has already begun to overshadow Trump's foreign policy moves, undermining the credibility of his administration abroad. The chaos inside Washington has not gone unnoticed in Moscow. Russian state media are openly mocking the American political crisis, portraying it as evidence of Western decay. Programs on Channel 1 and RT emphasize the moral collapse of the United States, suggesting that the world is witnessing the end of American dominance. This propaganda is being amplified across social media through coordinated campaigns linked to Russian and Chinese troll farms. The goal is simple: to weaken Western confidence and deepen divisions within allied societies. European security services have documented a surge in disinformation targeting audiences in Germany, France, and Italy, often spreading narratives about energy shortages, economic decline, and alleged corruption in Ukrainian aid programs. The strategy is not new, but its scale is unprecedented. In parallel, the situation in Venezuela continues to escalate. Following the interception of the Centurio's supertanker, the Maduro government accused the U.S. of economic aggression and announced joint naval drills with Russia and Iran in the Caribbean Sea. The exercises, scheduled for early January, are being described by Pentagon officials as provocative and unnecessary. Intelligence sources believe that Moscow is using Venezuela as a proxy front to stretch U.S. military attention, forcing Washington to divide its focus between Eastern Europe and Latin America. This approach mirrors Soviet-era tactics, creating simultaneous pressure points across continents to dilute Western strategic response. Analysts at the Rand Corporation warn that the Kremlin may attempt similar disruptions through partnerships in Africa or the Arctic, where Russian resource interests collide with Western investments. Back on the front lines of Ukraine, the human cost continues to rise. Exclusive footage released by the 77th Ukrainian Brigade's Rubaka drone battalion shows Russian troops emerging from a gas pipeline near Novoplatonivka, only to be targeted by drone strikes seconds later. The operation reportedly eliminated 40 enemy soldiers in a single engagement. These kinds of small, precise attacks have become symbols of Ukraine's adaptability and technological innovation. But they also reveal the grinding, relentless nature of this war. Each destroyed position, each explosion in a Russian warehouse, is part of a slow, attritional struggle that shows no sign of ending. Russian forces still advance, albeit with catastrophic losses, toward Sloviansk and the Donbas industrial belt. For Ukraine, every day of resistance carries both heroism and exhaustion. Inside Russia, cracks in the system are beginning to show. The number of domestic incidents involving veterans of the so-called special military operation has risen sharply. In Vladivostok, a woman recorded a video describing how an intoxicated serviceman attacked her in a restaurant. She said she saw no point in reporting it to the police, convinced that authorities would protect him because he was a soldier. Her story echoes hundreds of similar cases documented across the country. Sociologists now warn that Russia faces a growing crisis of militarized violence, a society where returning soldiers, often traumatized and unpunished, are turning their aggression inward. At the same time, family members of conscripts continue to release desperate video appeals, begging for help. One of them, Ekaterina from the 58th Army, spoke directly to Putin, pleading for her wounded husband not to be sent back to the front. "They send the disabled back to die," she said, "and no one cares." Her message, ignored by state television, spread across Telegram channels and independent media, becoming a symbol of the silent dissent inside Russia. And yet, despite all of this, the battlefield losses, the economic decay, the growing unrest, Vladimir Putin remains unyielding. On December 19th, during his live press conference, he once again demanded that Ukraine withdraw from the regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, claiming that Russian forces were advancing on all fronts. His tone was confident, almost detached from reality, but it reflects a dangerous truth. The Kremlin still believes it can win through persistence, manipulation, and fatigue. This is the essence of Russia's strategy now, not to win swiftly, but to wait for its opponents to tire. For Ukraine, survival depends on continued Western support, both financial and military. Every missile, every drone, every piece of armor delivered from abroad represents another day of resistance. But that support is not guaranteed. Inside the U.S., political divisions have turned aid into a bargaining chip. In Europe, economic fatigue and populist rhetoric are eroding unity. Putin is betting on time and on the weakness of Western resolve. Whether he is right will depend on what happens next in Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv. So as this report draws to a close, one truth becomes clear. This war, both seen and unseen, is far from over. Its outcome will not be decided by one battle or one negotiation, but by a long contest of endurance, will, and belief. The decisions made in the coming months, in the White House, in the Kremlin, and on the front lines of Donbass, will shape not only the future of Ukraine, but the destiny of Europe itself. This is not just a regional conflict. It is the defining test of a generation. A confrontation between democracy and authoritarianism, between truth and manipulation, between fatigue and determination. The world is watching, waiting to see who blinks first. Stay informed, stay aware, and if you value real reporting and deep analysis, make sure to subscribe. Because what comes next will determine how history remembers this moment.